My name is Kael Merrick, and I'm just another regular person living in Boulder, Colorado. I'm not a writer, speaker, or anything like that. I don't expect you to believe what I'm about to tell you. But my story isn't about convincing anyone. It's about something that changed the way I see life, and perhaps, who knows, it could change yours too. It all started on a day that seemed absolutely ordinary. It was an ordinary Tuesday, and the sun was shining on Boulder, as it always did on spring mornings. I remember feeling the cool breeze as I biked to the University of Colorado campus. My backpack was heavy with the usual books, and I had just devoured a bagel on the way. Nothing indicated that that day would be different. My PE class was one of those that I considered more of a formality than something meaningful. The teacher, Mr. Calloway, always began with the same words. "Today, we're going to run to warm up." That day, however, it seemed like he wanted to prepare us for the Olympics. We ran in the open field on campus, a space surrounded by trees that danced in the wind. My colleagues were well ahead, but I didn't mind being a little behind. It was my rhythm. I took a deep breath, feeling the air filling my lungs, until something changed. First, it was the weight on my chest. It wasn't pain, but pressure, as if someone had placed a concrete block there. Then came the weakness in my legs, a sensation I had never experienced before. My vision began to blur, and the sound of laughter and footsteps around me became distant, as if I were being sucked into a tunnel. I tried to stop and call for help, but my legs gave out before I could do anything. The last thing I heard was someone shouting, "Kael fell!" Then, everything went out. I don't know how much time has passed, but I found myself in a strange state. It was like I was awake, but not in the same place. There was no light, just comfortable darkness. I remember feeling a deep silence, a kind of peace I had never experienced before. Suddenly, I felt a pull, as if something was transporting me. It was then that I opened my eyes and realized that I was no longer on the running field. Something inexplicable was happening. When I opened my eyes, the light was different, dimmer and hazier. At first I thought I was in some kind of dream, but the sensation was very real. The air was heavy, full of gray particles falling like snow. I looked around and realized I was in a place that seemed like something out of a nightmare. Buildings were destroyed, some reduced to rubble, while others remained standing, but completely empty, like hollow shells of a world that no longer existed. Abandoned cars were scattered across the streets, many of them charred, their carcasses twisted. The silence was frightening. There was no wind, birds, or any natural sounds, just the muffled sound of my footsteps on the ash-covered floor. I walked aimlessly, trying to understand where I was. This is a dream, I thought repeatedly, trying to convince myself, but the acrid smell in the air and the rough feel of the ash on my skin said otherwise. I passed a fallen sign that had the name of a street on it, but it was so damaged that I couldn't read it. In the midst of the ruins, I noticed small details: a baby carriage turned on its side, a children's bicycle with a wheel missing, broken toys among the debris. Each object seemed to tell a story of lives cut short. As he continued walking, despair began to take over. There was no one, no living soul, no sign of life. What had happened? Was I alone at the end of the world? My heart, or whatever was in my chest at that moment, seemed to tighten unbearably. "Is anyone there?" My voice echoed, but there was no response, just the same oppressive silence. I tried to remember what had happened before I passed out. The race, the field, my colleagues. Was it possible that I had died? No, that can't be, I thought, shaking my head. But the idea began to take root in me. Was I in some kind of limbo? As these questions consumed me, I began to feel a presence. It wasn't something I saw or heard, but something I felt, a vibration in the air, as if someone or something was there, watching. It was then that, amidst the dense fog of ash, a figure appeared. He walked towards me, standing out from the surroundings. He was wearing an impeccable white robe, which seemed immune to the dirt around it. His presence was serene, yet imposing. He seemed to be in no rush, and his eyes met mine with an intensity that made me freeze in place. When he got close enough, he opened his mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out. However, I clearly heard his words in my mind. "You need to see it." Before I could ask what he meant or who he was, he disappeared, as if he had never been there. I stood still for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. Something told me that my journey was just beginning. After the sudden appearance and disappearance of the figure in white, I stood there in a daze. The weight of silence returned with full force, now accompanied by a new kind of restlessness. Who was he? What did he mean by, "You need to see"? My mind swirled around these questions as I tried to make some sense of what was happening. I walked through the ruins, my steps kicking up little swirls of ash. The place seemed immense, like a maze with no way out, but at the same time, it was claustrophobic, with debris piling up around me. After wandering for some time, I again felt the presence that had alerted me before. It was like a subtle change in the atmosphere, a warmth that contrasted with the emotional cold of the place. I looked around, hoping to find that figure again, and it didn't take long for him to appear. This time, the man in white was closer. His presence was even more striking, as if he carried the weight of something I couldn't understand. He was neither young nor old, but his expression held a deep calm, like someone who had already seen everything the world had to offer. "Who are you?" I asked, finally breaking the silence. My voice sounded strangely weak in that empty place. He didn't respond with words, but his eyes penetrated mine, and it was as if a flood of emotions and meanings flooded my mind. It was as if he was showing me a movie with no images, just sensations, fear, loss, destruction, and finally, a glimmer of hope. "You need to see it." The phrase echoed in my mind again, this time clearer, more firm. "What do I need to see?" I begged, my voice cracking. "What's going on? What is this place?" He raised his hand, pointing to the horizon. There was nothing there but rubble and ash, but somehow I understood that this was where I was supposed to go. A vision of the past. Before disappearing again, he left something behind, a small white flower that sprouted from the ground, as a sign that life could still emerge, even in the midst of devastation. I stared at that flower, mesmerized. I touched it gently, and as I did so, I was invaded by a new wave of images. I saw people living their lives in a normal world, but there was something wrong. Conflict, selfishness, greed, all permeate human interactions. Small acts of disrespect piled up, like drops filling a cup until it overflowed. That's when I realized the destruction around me hadn't started suddenly. It was a slow process, a series of choices that led to an inevitable collapse. When the vision ceased, the man in white was no longer there. But something inside me had changed. His words and gestures, although minimal, carried immeasurable weight. I didn't know what would come next, but I was sure he was a guide, someone trying to show me something crucial, something I didn't yet fully understand. I took a deep breath and headed in the direction he had pointed, prepared, or at least trying to prepare myself, for what was to come. As I walked towards the horizon that the man in white had pointed to, the ground seemed to disappear beneath my feet. It was as if an invisible force had pulled me to another place. I didn't have time to react, to scream or resist. Everything around me changed instantly. Suddenly, I found myself in a room full of advanced technology, surrounded by monitors that were frantically flashing, graphics moving up and down, and alarms echoing at a deafening pace. The place was cramped and claustrophobic, packed with people in military uniforms. Some shouted commands, others typed frantically on keyboards. I realized I was in a military command center. There were maps projected on the walls, showing territories and missile trajectories in red. In the center of the room, a middle-aged man with a stern expression seemed to be leading the operation. He wore a uniform with insignia indicating his position of authority. "Confirmed. Enemy missile launch detected," shouted a young soldier, her voice thick with tension. "Estimated time of impact, 22 minutes, said another person, looking at a monitor. I was in the middle of the chaos, but no one seemed to notice me. It was as if I were an invisible spectator, unable to intervene or be heard. "Commander Ellis," said a tall, thin man, apparently an aide, "we cannot afford to wait. If we don't retaliate now, we will be destroyed." The commander clenched his fists, looking at the map. "What if it's a mistake? If we launch now, we will cross a line from which there is no return. Do you want to gamble the safety of millions on a question?" insisted the advisor. The heated debate continued, with voices overlapping and the tension increasing by the second. I wanted to scream, beg them to stop, but I knew it would be useless. After a few minutes that seemed like an eternity, the commander took a deep breath, his eyes showing a mix of fear and determination. He walked over to a center console where there was a large red button protected by a glass cover. "God help us," he murmured as he opened the lid and pressed the button. The silence in the room was instantaneous. All eyes were fixed on the monitors where missile trajectories began to appear. Red lines came out from various locations on the map, pointing to targets around the world. The screens showed devastating explosions, one after another. Entire cities were reduced to ashes in seconds. I saw images of people running, trying to protect themselves, but there was nowhere to run. The world was literally falling apart, and I could do nothing but watch. One of the screens showed Boulder, my hometown, being consumed by a wave of fire. The sight hit me like a punch in the gut. "No, no, no!" I screamed, but my voice was swallowed by the sound of alarms and explosions. As chaos took over the command center, the commander fell to his knees, staring at the ground. His expression was one of complete despair. He knew he had condemned the world. Suddenly, I felt the same pull that had brought me to that place. The room began to disappear, but the emotional impact of that vision remained. The voice of the man in white echoed in my mind again. "Pride and fear have destroyed the world." After the emotional breakdown in the command center, I felt that pull again, as if my body was being pulled by an invisible force. I instinctively closed my eyes, and when I opened them, everything had changed again. I was floating in the void, surrounded by infinite darkness dotted with stars. There was no gravity, just the feeling of being suspended, like a formless observer. Before me, the earth slowly rotated. Her normally comforting beauty now seemed fragile and vulnerable. The planet was illuminated by tiny points of light, cities shining like jewels in the dark. But that view soon began to change. As I watched, I saw the first missile hit the ground. A burst of blinding light illuminated the planet, followed by a wave of darkness as the city lights disappeared. A second missile hit another point, and then a third. In a matter of minutes, the planet, which previously seemed full of life, began to go out like a bad light bulb. Each explosion was a blow to the heart of humanity. I watched helplessly as the pattern repeated itself. With each impact, the lights disappeared, and the planet became darker. The silence of space made everything even more cruel. As the destruction continued, I felt that familiar presence again. The man in white was at my side, floating like me, but with a serenity that contrasted with the horror around us. He didn't speak, but his eyes turned to earth. Then, his voice resonated in my mind. "What you see is a reflection of what lives in the hearts of men. Pride, greed, and hatred paved this path." I tried to respond, but I couldn't form words. My mind was overwhelmed by the sight of destruction, by the weight of what it meant. The earth, now almost completely erased, looked like a dead celestial body. Clouds of smoke from the explosions began to cover the planet, obscuring what was left of its surface. Where there were once vibrant shades of blue and green, there was now gray and black. "Is this the future?" I asked finally, my voice shaking. "Or is it a warning?" The man in white didn't respond immediately. He just looked at me, his expression serious, but not without compassion. "Destruction is not inevitable, Kael," he said finally, "but the current path will lead to that unless different choices are made." As I floated there, observing what was left of the planet, a feeling of helplessness came over me. But along with it came a spark of something else, the idea that maybe there was still time. The man in white touched my shoulder, and his touch seemed to carry a warmth that contrasted with the cold emptiness around us. "Even in the deepest darkness, there is light. You need to help find that light." Before I could ask how or what he expected of me, I felt that familiar tug once again. My body began to transport again, and the vision of the destroyed earth disappeared. When the feeling of displacement ceased, I opened my eyes and found myself in a devastated place. What was left of earth was unrecognizable. The sky was permanently gray, covered in thick clouds of smoke that blocked out the sunlight. The floor was cracked and covered in dust, with dark stains that indicated where fires and explosions had consumed everything. There were no trees, just burned trunks and scattered debris. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, with a smell of death and decay. The silence of the space had been replaced by occasional sounds. distant screams, hurried footsteps, and sometimes the sound of gunshots echoing in the distance. I walked around the scene, trying to understand where I was and what was happening. I soon noticed small groups of people moving through the ruins. Their faces were pale and full of despair, their bodies thin and covered in tattered clothes. They carried what little they could find: bottles of water, crushed cans of food, improvised tools. A larger group was gathered near a fire. The fire was small and unstable, but it seemed to be his only source of heat. I heard whispers between them, conversations filled with distrust. "We can't trust them," said a tall man with a scraggly beard, pointing to another group approaching in the distance. "They're going to rob us, like everyone else." "What if they just want help?" asked a younger woman, holding a small child in her arms. "Help? There is no such thing anymore," he replied bitterly. "It's every man for himself now." I continued walking and found another smaller group. Unlike before, they were gathered in a circle, holding hands. In the center, a frail-looking woman led a prayer. "Lord, even in the midst of chaos, we trust in you," she said, her voice shaking but full of conviction. "Help us find a way. Keep hope alive." Some of the faces around him looked skeptical, while others were bathed in tears. It was a contrasting scene. In a world where everything seemed lost, that small group was still searching for faith and solidarity. Suddenly, I felt the presence of the man in white again. He was there, standing a considerable distance away, but even so his figure was unmistakable. I walked up to him, and he greeted me with a deep look. "You have seen what happens when humanity chooses selfishness, pride, and greed," he said, his voice echoing in my mind. "But even here, in the worst-case scenario, there are still those who choose love and faith. These small acts are the light that prevents total darkness." "So there is hope?" I asked, my voice full of uncertainty. "There is always hope," he replied, "but it depends on choices, individual choices, which add up and create something bigger. Even now, in the midst of devastation, every small action makes a difference." He turned to look at the horizon, where columns of smoke rose into the sky. "The destruction didn't start with the bombs," he continued. "It started with people's hardened hearts, with the moment they stopped seeing each other as sisters and brothers." His words weighed on me like a responsibility I didn't know if I was capable of carrying. "What can I do? I'm just one person," I said, feeling small compared to what he was describing. He placed a hand on my shoulder. "You will see. Small changes create big waves. Your journey is not over yet." Before I could ask further, he disappeared again. After the sudden absence of the man in white, I was left alone again, with his words echoing in my mind. The destruction had not started with the missiles. It had been born in people's hearts, in their daily choices. I couldn't help but wonder, how could something so small, so imperceptible, grow to the point of destroying an entire world? I looked up at the gray, desolate sky above me. There were no stars, no natural light, just smoke and darkness. It was a reflection of everything he had said. Small choices make big waves, I muttered to myself, trying to digest the weight of that truth. As I walked through the ruins, he appeared once again. This time, he looked different. His presence was still serene, but there was an urgency in his eyes, as if every second counted. He gestured for me to follow him, and I did so without hesitation. He took me to an open field, where I could see the wreckage of a once vibrant world. Abandoned cars were piled up, destroyed buildings seemed to beg for redemption, and small groups of survivors moved like shadows. "Look around you," he said, pointing at the scene. "This is just not the future that could be. It is a reflection of what is already present in the hearts of many." I turned to him, my voice full of doubt. "But how did we get here? How could something so horrible happen? Were there no signs? Didn't someone try to stop this?" He sighed, his gaze filled with compassion. "The signs were always there. Every act of selfishness, every moment of pride, every decision made without considering others were like stones thrown into a lake. The waves of these choices spread, amplifying each other, until destruction became inevitable. And now, is there nothing else to do?" I asked, almost desperate. He came closer, looking deeply into my eyes. "There's always something to do, Kael. Every small action of love, compassion, and forgiveness can be a seed of change. What you do, how you live your life, inspires those around you. This is how the world changes, from the inside out, one person at a time. He stretched out his hand, and in the air before us, a vision appeared. I saw a small scene, a man helping an elderly woman to cross a street. Then this woman, with a smile, helped a child who had fallen. The child, in turn, grew up and did something great, helping entire communities. See? He asked. It all starts with an act. Kindness breeds kindness, just as hate breeds destruction. As the vision faded, he continued, but time is short, Kael. The world can still change, but it depends on choices that need to start now. You have the power to influence others, to show that there is another way. It's not easy, but it's necessary. I swallowed hard, feeling the gravity of what he was saying. Why me? Why show me this? He smiled slightly, almost as if he was expecting this question. Because you are willing to listen, and that's a start. Before I could respond, he began to fade away again, but his last words stuck in my mind. Live with purpose, Kael. Show the world that there is still light. I stood in the desolate field, taking in everything he had shown me. For the first time, I felt that I carried not only a responsibility, but also a spark of hope. I felt like I was being pulled again, but this time in a different way. It wasn't just a transition to another scenario. It was like my body was being sucked back into reality. Sounds began to fill my ears, a constant beeping, muffled voices, the rustling of papers. My head was spinning, and when I finally opened my eyes, I was blinded by an intense white light. Little by little, the vision came back into focus. The white ceiling of a hospital appeared above me, and next to the bed were devices connected to my body. My chest hurt, as if an immense weight had been forcibly lifted, but I was alive. He's waking up, I heard a female voice say, and when I turned my head, I saw a woman in a white coat approaching. His eyes were alert, but there was a smile of relief on his face. Welcome back, Kael, she said calmly. I'm Dr. Hartman. You were very lucky. L Place. My voice was hoarse, almost inaudible. You're at the university hospital, she explained. His heart stopped for a few minutes. It was a race against time to get him back, but we did it. Before I could process everything, the door opened and my father walked in, his face etched with worry. David Merrick was a practical man, always down to earth, and he seemed even more serious than usual. Kael, he exclaimed, rushing over to the bed. Thank God! I thought I lost you. Father, I murmured, trying to speak, but emotion and tiredness took over me. You need to rest, Dr. Hartman said, placing a hand on my father's shoulder. He's still fragile, but he's out of danger now. My father nodded, but his eyes never left mine. Despite her strong stance, I could see the relief and fragility hidden behind her expression. As they spoke, my mind went back to the visions I had seen, the desert of ash, the command center, global destruction, the man in white. Everything seemed so real, so vivid, but now I was here, alive, and I wondered if it was all just a delirium brought on by the cardiac arrest. Dr. Hartman, I called, voice still weak. I saw things during that. She looked at me with a mix of curiosity and professionalism. Many people report intense experiences when they go through something like this. You had a near-death experience, Kael. It can be difficult to process at first, but it felt so real, I murmured, more to myself than to her. My father remained by my side until I fell asleep again, and as sleep took me, the man in white's words echoed in my mind. Small changes make big waves. That night, I dreamed of the flower he had left behind in the ash desert. She was still alive, even in the midst of the devastation. When I woke up in the morning, something in me had changed. I was alive, and that was no coincidence. The visions, real or not, carried a message I couldn't ignore. There was a reason I came back, and I knew I had to find out what it was. After a few days in the hospital, I returned home to Boulder. My body was still weak, and my father insisted that I be in his care. Despite the family atmosphere, nothing seemed the same. Every object in my room, every sound in the street, seemed charged with new significance. It was as if I had awakened to a reality that I had previously ignored. The first night at home, lying in bed, The fragments of the visions returned with full force. The man in white, his words, the world in ruins. Every scene seemed recorded in my mind. I couldn't ignore the message he had given me. Something needed to change, and I felt like my life would be the starting point. "Kael, are you sure you're okay?" asked my father one night while we were eating dinner. He seemed hesitant, as if he was afraid of the answer. "I'm alive, Dad," I replied, setting the fork aside. "And that's more than I could ask for." He frowned, clearly not satisfied with the vague answer. "You've changed, son. Something happened while you were in that state. Do you want to talk about it?" I looked at him, trying to find the right words. "I saw things, Dad. I don't know how to explain it, but I felt like I was somewhere between life and death. And there, I saw what could happen if we continue living as we are." He stared at me silently for a moment before saying, "That feels heavy, but, Kael, you don't need to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders. Just focus on recovering." I nodded, but I knew it was impossible to ignore what I had seen. The following week, I started taking small steps. First, I volunteered at a local homeless shelter. It was simple, serving meals, listening to stories, and sometimes just being present. But for me, each act was a reminder that real change starts with small, tangible actions. Emma, my best friend, was surprised by the change. "You've always been a good person, Kael, but this is different. What motivated you to start all this?" I looked at her and, for the first time, shared a part of my experience. "I realized how connected we are, Emma. Everything we do, no matter how small, can affect someone else. And if I can be a positive part of this chain, why not try?" She smiled, placing her hand on my shoulder. "If you need help, I'm here. Let's do this together." Over time, my small acts began to inspire others. Emma and I organized a food drive for the shelter, and to our surprise, dozens of people showed up to help. University students, neighbors, and even strangers contributed. The movement grew, and within a few months, it turned into a larger community project. It wasn't something big or revolutionary, but it made a difference. Between each activity, I still struggled with memories of the visions. They served as a constant reminder of what could happen, but also as motivation to continue. One night, while walking down the quiet streets of Boulder, I found myself looking up at the starry sky. The man in white's words came to my mind again. "Live with purpose." I took a deep breath, feeling a peace that I hadn't experienced in a long time. I knew I couldn't change the whole world alone, but maybe I could shine a light, even a small one, in the corner where I lived. Months had passed since my near-death experience, but the memories were still as vivid as if they had happened yesterday. Looking at my life now, I realize how much the visions changed me. Before, I lived apathetically, stuck in a routine and focused only on small, personal goals. Today, every choice seems loaded with meaning. As I walk through Boulder, I see the city with different eyes, the majestic mountains, the open sky, the smiles of the people around me. All of this is a reminder that the world still has beauty and goodness, but I also know that this beauty is fragile, dependent on the choices we make each day. The impact of what I started to do goes beyond me. My friend Emma is now one of the leaders of the community project we started together. She brought new ideas, like offering free practical skills classes at the shelter, helping people start over. Even my father, initially skeptical, began to get involved. He attended one of our food drives and has since become a regular volunteer. "You were right, Kael," he told me once. "Helping people gives life a greater purpose." I needed it as much as they did. These small acts grew like a chain. People who previously ignored each other now came together, showing that kindness can be contagious. The man in white's words still echo in my mind, especially in moments of doubt. When I wonder if I'm doing enough, I remember what he said. Small changes make big waves. It reminds me that I don't have to save the world alone. I can make a difference here, now, in the space I am in. Even though my life has changed, that doesn't mean everything is easy. I still struggle with fatigue, frustrations, and the temptation to return to apathy. But every time I feel this way, I remember the visions of the devastated earth, of people struggling to survive, of the hope that's still shown in small acts of solidarity. These images are not just a warning. They are a choice I need to make every day, and I know that other people can make that choice too. Today, I live with hope. I know the world is imperfect and full of challenges, but I deeply believe that we can still change it, not with grand heroic gestures, but with the small decisions we make daily, helping someone, offering a smile, forgiving, being kind. The man in white's message wasn't just about avoiding destruction. It was about building something better, something that lasts. I don't know who he was or why he chose me to see it, but I'm grateful. As I write these words in my mind, I know that my story is still being written. The difference I make may seem small, but I know it is significant, because in the end, as the man in white said, change begins within each of us. And you? What choices will you make today?